Chapter 12. God and Dylan Thomas. How old are you? The guidance counselor had put on her stern voice. 15. 15? 15? She acted as if she were surprised that someone that old still needed to be called to Stuyvesant's guidance office. At 15, you should know that you need to be responsible for what you are doing in school. Do you want to transfer? No, I answered, subdued. Then you will have to get yourself on the stick, Mr. Myers, and you'd better do so fairly quickly. I expect you to be in school every day for the rest of the year, and on time, young man. Yes, ma'am. What do you do with yourself all day? Nothing, I said, surprised that her voice had softened somewhat. Nothing. I'd been out of school 3 weeks, leaving home each morning and walking to the subway, sometimes fully intending to go to school, only to get off the A train and time again at 59th Street and wander into Central Park. I had discovered the pleasure of comparing different translations of the same word, and would search them out. It was fascinating to me to see the small changes in language and phrasing from one book to the next. What do you do with yourself all day? Sometimes, if I had the money, I would go to the movies on 42nd Street. The Apollo Theater, the one on 42nd Street, showed foreign movies. I saw a film of Gorky's The Lower Depths there, and fell in love with Greta Garbo and Camille. What do you do with yourself all day? Sometimes I would go to Riverside Drive and look out blindly over the dreary Hudson River. I would take my notebook and write dark poems, which I would often later discard. They always said too much about me, and then again, never quite enough. So, young man, the counselor had said, putting on her interviewer's voice, I expect quite a lot of improvement from you. You have this intern and 1 more year to get yourself together and go on to college. Now report back to your homeroom teacher first, and then your class. I nodded, gathered my books, and walked out of the school. Years later I saw a movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off, in which Ferris, the hero, was happily defiant and disdainful of the system. Everyone in the school was a cut below Ferris, as were his parents. His day away from school, replete with all the money he needed to enjoy the romp with his friends, was one of triumph. I didn't want to be defiant. I wanted to be in the system that I was walking away from, but I didn't know how to get in. The school sent the end-of-year report card, and I read it, surprised that I had passed some classes I had rarely attended. They were looking for a way to pass me, and if I had passed the interns, they moved me on. I resolved to do better next year, again. Summer. The Amsterdam News assessed the chances of the Brooklyn Dodgers. If they lost again, it would be a blow to the chances of blacks in the major leagues, they said. The Dodgers had more black players than anyone, and the Yankees had very few. The Yankees were a white team. I had lost faith in the Dodgers' ability to win a World Series, but I still loved them. I played little ball during the summer. There was a coaches' tournament up at City College that I didn't get into. I played little ball during the summer. There was a coaches' tournament up at City College that I did get into, but my growing depression was affecting my game. I didn't believe in myself anymore. I was thin, weighed less than 175 pounds, and fast enough to play guard, but the guys in the tournament were good. Some players came up from Philadelphia. Wilt Chamberlain was one of them. Ball players knew where the important games were going to be held, and the best ball players from all over the city were at the games. Coaches or scouts from around the country also attended. There were a few professional black basketball players in the National Basketball League, but not that many. The big push was to find players who might play college ball. I watched mostly from the sidelines and got into one game briefly, only to discover that the players were a whole level better than me. I got caught in a blind switch and found myself standing behind Chamberlain. He backed into me, and I felt his butt in my chest. I grabbed him when the ball came into the paint, and he went up as if he hadn't even noticed me hanging on. There was a lot of talk about basketball scholarships, and I thought about trying to get up my interest in ball again. I played more that summer than I had for a while and began to see weaknesses in my game. Or perhaps it was just that whenever I looked at myself, I saw weaknesses where a few years earlier I had seen strengths. Fatty, my basketball coach, told me that my first step to the basket was good, but my second was weak. Your first step has to get you into position to get past the defender, he said. The second step has to be strong enough to prevent him from recovering. I went to the playground every morning to practice that second step. On my way to one of the practice sessions, I saw Frank for the first time. It was early morning, and the park was still empty of the hordes of kids who filled it each day. I was headed toward the first court when I saw a fight in the far ends of the courts. There were 3 guys circling one. They took turns swinging at the guy in the middle. He was clearly not a good fighter. I went closer. One of the attackers had a chain, and the other 2 were using fists. They were all about my age, maybe a year or so older. The fight wasn't my business, but somehow I was drawn to it. I moved very close to them, getting into their space, and was told to get lost before I got my face broken. I hit the guy who spoke to me, the one with the chain. His knees buckled, and he went down. The fellow being attacked, given a moment's respite, fiercely attacked one of the others. In a moment, the 3 attackers were running toward the fence surrounding the basketball courts and climbing over it. They stopped long enough to issue threats from where they stood on the grass surrounding the basketball courts, and then they moved on. The guy who had been attacked thanked me, and I asked him what the fight had been about. He was 6 feet, with light mottled skin and sandy brown hair, with a streak of even lighter hair near the front. His eyes were large and pink-rimmed. He told me that the guys had wanted to rob him, and had started the fight when they found out he didn't have any money. He told me that his name was Frank Hall, and I told him mine. We walked out of the park together, and he thanked me again for helping him out. You don't mind fighting, he asked. I shrugged no. I didn't like fighting, I thought. But something inside me was happy about being in the fight. It hadn't mattered so much that it was 3 against 1, or that one of Frank's attackers had used a chain. It was more a feeling that when I was fighting, I stopped feeling the sense of helplessness that seemed to be overtaking me. I'd hoped to be part of a special way of life. That life would have had to do with ideas and people who took those ideas and shaped them into a kind of power. But that life seemed, in my growing isolation, even more remote. It was as if I were standing on the sidewalk on the main drag of my existence, looking through the glass at all of life's goodies, but could not find an open door. Smashing the window would not make me welcome, but it would say that I was there. Frank offered me half of the money he did have, and I refused it. He told me he lived near 116th Street. I didn't make much of the fact that he didn't give me an exact address. We said goodbye in front of my house. At home, 2 women friends of my mother sat with her in the kitchen. Miss Daly and Louise were drinking beer. Mama's speech was slurred, and she told me to say hello to Jean, Louise's granddaughter, who was in the living room. I went to the living room, said hello to Jean, who was about my age and thoroughly unlikable, and went to my room. In my room, I lay across the bed and listened to the radio. I thought about what had happened in the park, and knew that I liked hitting the guy who had the chain. I also thought about Jean. I didn't like her, but she was a girl, and girls interested me. When I heard older guys talk about girls, I was taken with the fact that they talked about it. I was more taken with the way they talked about it than with what they said. They talked as if this was some great thing is the best thing that ever happened to them, and that it was normal. If I hadn't had relations, and didn't know a thing about it except what I learned from Eric, or thought I had learned. But I knew I didn't have the same degree of interest that was being expressed by some of the guys around the edge of the basketball court. Although I didn't know the ins and outs of sexuality, I did understand that there was a connection between homosexuality and being called F-word. F-word were often pictured, especially in black community, as speaking with exaggerated precision, reciting poetry, and listening to classical music. Logically, I knew that loving books and writing did not make me homosexual, but more and more I hid those interests. The church was the center of my community when I was a child, and much of who I was came from what I had been taught at the church of the Master. What I understood, my philosophy was based on the New Testament. I believed in this great sense of fairness overseen by God Himself that would reward the good and pure of heart. But now things weren't turning out the way I thought they should, and I didn't know what to do about it. I wondered if God was truly on the watch, or whether religion, as well as my belief in God, would turn into yet another disappointment. I wrote a long letter to Reverend Robinson expressing my doubts. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from him that said, in effect, that when he, too, sometimes had doubts, he relied on his faith to carry him through. That wasn't what I wanted to know. I wanted him to give me a telephone number that I could use to call God directly and get the straight scoop. I wanted to hear a big voice on the phone say, "Yeah, verily, this is me, God. It's all good, my man, and we'll be ultra cool in the end. Don't worry about it." Over the summer, I read a biography of the anarchist Emma Goldman. I liked the book because much of it took place in the areas of New York with which I was familiar. I was particularly interested in Leon Clogius, a young man who had tried to join the anarchists but had been rejected by them. Goldman said that he was a troubled young man looking for a cause to join. When he was rejected by the New York anarchists, he tried to prove himself by killing President McKinley. "I killed McKinley because I love the people," he is quoted as saying. Like Clogius, I considered myself an outsider and longed to commit a heroic act that would make me belong. It was the same reasoning that some friends of mine used when they joined gangs. We read The Red Badge of Courage in school, and over the summer I read and enjoyed A History of the Civil War by Bruce Catton. This was my first major encounter with historical nonfiction, and I found it fascinating. I was still trying to figure out the business of race. Most of what I read and heard was negative. Blacks had been slaves, blacks had been lynched, blacks could not eat in this place or that. There was little positive published about blacks except in the black press. The Amsterdam News ran stories about Negroes who had made good, and about some who hadn't. A new beauty parlor opened. Bumpy Johnson, the dope dealer, lost an appeal, and Langston Hughes, described as the poet, gave a party. Walking with my brother along 7th Avenue, I once saw a gathering around a brown-skinned man who was being interviewed by some white reporters. Mickey and I went over and found that the man was Langston Hughes. We listened to him talk. He sounded like any black man on the street. There was nothing extraordinary about him, nothing that lifted him out of the ordinary. His humor was gentle, thoughtful. I was disappointed. When I pictured the idea of writer in my mind, pictures from my school book came to mind, and Hughes did not fit that picture. What I didn't admit was that neither did I. It would be years before I would meet Hughes again, and even longer before I would understand what we had in common, what we suffered in common. I didn't tell him that I was a writer. I wish I had. I also heard for the first time the poet Dylan Thomas on the radio. He read some of his poetry, including The White Giant's Thigh, and it was my 13th year to heaven. He was said to frequent the White House, a bar down on the west side. I went down to the bar wearing my blue sports jacket, which I thought made me look older. The bar was full of beer drinkers, all white, and at least in their 20s, if not older. I ordered a Coke, but the bartender, who wasn't a bit fooled about my age, told me to leave. I asked the bearded man sitting at the bar if Dylan Thomas was there. He had been, the man said, and had already been carried out drunk. The man who related the story seemed disgusted by Thomas, but the whole scene was exciting to me, and that a man who had written and recited his poetry had been carried out drunk was wonderfully romantic. I wanted to do something wonderfully romantic to fulfill my idea of what I thought a writer should be. Dylan Thomas, with his high ethereal voice and poetry, was at times incomprehensible, fulfilled that idea, whereas Hughes, writing about ordinary people and about a very mundane Harlem, did not fulfill that idea. "What are you writing about?" a student asked me in Student Investment when I returned in September, full of hope and resolve. "What are you trying to do with your poems?" What I was trying was not to do anything. what I was trying to be somebody I could recognize.